Hello, digital zoning. My name is Kai Reaver. I'm an architect, PhD researcher at the Oslo School of Architecture and Design. Feedback from the last talk I gave in this manner was that 20 minutes could be a bit long. So I'm going to give you the too long didn't read version first, and then you can decide if you want to spend the next 18 minutes listening to this or not. So we can use zoning laws to regulate spatial technologies such as 5G and augmented reality. That's point one. So if you're interested in technology being regulated as it becomes more spatial and the connections to zoning laws that we have within urban planning, you might be interested in this talk. The second is that by prototyping technology development within public institutions rather than outside of them, it seems that we can get better results that also function as an extension of the sort of institutional democratic values that we have. Specifically, from my research context of Norway, within the Nordic welfare state, which has a large public sector and a high degree of trust between citizens and its government. So if you're interested in those aspects of this talk, I also suggest that you keep listening. And if not, that's fine. I'm sure we'll meet again in some other point. Thanks. So let's see. The context of this research comes from a research project called Digital Urban Living, which has been going on here in Oslo for the past 11 years. It's a bit unique as we combine urbanists, architects, technologists, interaction designers into the project to look at, I guess, what we would now call the smart city. Specifically, we're a bit concerned how the kind of dominant technology model we see sort of in the urban environment is one that's been primarily imported from like the specific ideology of the kind of Silicon Valley Californian type. And we see that a lot of these services tend to kind of challenge the democratic institutions that have been built up within the post-war welfare state. The second aspect, of course, is the sort of Chinese model of technology, which is very top-down, which we also see doesn't quite fit with the societal model here in the Nordic region. So our question is really, is it possible to have a Nordic smart city? And if it is, what would that be like? So my research specifically is about looking at the kind of spatialization of many technologies. So moving from the screen into things like augmented reality, virtual reality, and now into things such as 5G. So there's issues of user privacy, the public realm, public space, but also some of these technologies can really increase the participatory and sort of democratic potential of some of the existing, let's say, planning and regulation systems that we have within the city. So coming as an architect with a bit of experience within the kind of formalities of urban planning and building permitting and these sorts of things, I'm also interested in how can we make those processes a bit more open and interesting, and also what kind of, let's say, aesthetic output into architecture and urbanism will those sorts of processes have. I'm sure many people are wondering what sort of happens after postmodernism. It could seem that a lot of these technologies are bringing in a sort of a collective authorship model along lines of sort of increasing democracy and increasing participation across sort of decision making within the city. So as I've spoken, the first point is really about technology regulation, which moves into the context of smart cities, which then sort of moves into this about merging disciplines. I think it's really important that we as architects look at what's been happening in urbanism, what's been happening in sort of environmental psychology and behavioral psychology, interaction design, user research, and really try to connect those two. So I'm looking at how do we sort of connect urban research, which looks at quite a bit at groups, and the sort of interaction design and user-oriented research, which looks quite a bit at individuals. And how can we sort of merge those two into a sort of coherent way of thinking? An interesting point here is the emergence of tech-free spaces around the world, which is signalizing a kind of need to look at how we could have a more nuanced relationship between technology and physical space. And the final point is sort of prototyping this model of digital zoning and working through some of the ways in which that could be done. The end goal of all of this is to develop both sort of policy guidelines, as we are coming from a public research institution with a relatively high degree of interaction with the Norwegian government and sort of how they should be thinking about technology, how they should be thinking about democracy, how they should be thinking about these new sort of spatial technologies. And the second component is design methods. So how do we integrate this with the practice of design of space, and particularly within the city? So looking at some older photographs, this is the street photography of Gary Winogrand. One cannot help but notice the contrast between an image like this from 1964 and an image like this, which could really be taken anywhere in this public realm today. And I think while we can sort of laugh at the sort of cliche of this type of image, I think what we have started to begin to notice is that what's going on within these private platforms is also sort of emulating and augmenting quite a bit of what was happening in the previous image. But it's also sort of displacing the role of public space. And in a way, we should be looking a bit not only at the sort of negative effects of smartphones in general, but we should also be looking at the fact that these phones are within public space, and with the onset of very highly precise positioning technologies such as 5G, the relationship between these phones existing in this space could perhaps be more articulated. This goes a bit in hand with how, at least in the past year or so, several high-end technology executives have been calling for the sector's own regulation, and that quite a bit of the technology we see coming is sort of becoming increasingly spatial. So things like facial recognition, augmented reality, 5G, all of this signalizes sort of technology becoming a component of physical space. And I think a video like this is Facebook's Memories project, demonstrates a bit of what I mean. So this is a project by Facebook where by using video and still imagery and a technology known as photogrammetry, you reconstruct the sort of private physical realm of the home, and you create a sort of 3D model of it. So I think many people are not aware of how a lot of this spatial technology works, but I think what's important is that most of it already exists, and with the onset again of things like augmented reality and 5G, they're becoming more precise, easier to use, easier to develop within. And so we'll probably be seeing a lot of the technology services that we know from social media moving into this realm. The Smart City is basically scaling that up to be a kind of societally encompassing project of sort of importing technology and sensors and these sorts of things into the urban realm. And I think a lot of the reason between the sort of discrepancy between the technology sector and a lot of the sort of physical planning sectors is this idea, this came from Google executives Eric Schmidt and Jared Cohen, about the internet basically being an experiment in anarchy. But it also encapsulates sort of hundreds of millions of people. And their claim is then that this online world is not bound by terrestrial laws. So I think my primary sort of argument is that this, as technology becomes more spatial, this claim is no longer true, and that the internet is likely to be bound by terrestrial laws, which are the sort of planning laws and physical regulations of space that we already have as they are related to land or the planet Earth. So then how do we regulate technology in physical space? That's a rhetorical question. I say at least one component of that is using the existing legal framework that we already have within physical space. And that could perhaps be demonstrated through a video like this. This is the Norwegian mapping authority, Kartverket's augmented reality prototype called Border Go. All they've really done is they've overlaid the property boundaries, which is public information, directly into the physical environment through augmented reality. And so I think what's important is these pink lines, which signalize property boundaries, are also signalizing the legal codes of physical space. So for example, the relationship between private and public space, which was also the relationship between private and public law in this sense. So one can imagine as this phone is crossing this invisible boundary between two different properties, or perhaps enters private space, that the technology service itself could then adhere to the sort of legal code of that space as it enters it. And this is, again, because technology is becoming so physically precise. We have many systems of law for planning and building and spatial regulation. These are specifically within the Nordic region, but this applies to most of the West. So we have, systems of planning, systems of building permits, systems of public participation within planning. We have the zoning plans themselves, which specify the sort of use of a space. We also have things such as preservation and listing for older buildings, and we have also open competitions and public procurement. So all of this is very highly regulated and has very sort of specific procedures. And a lot of my research has then been how do we sort of insert technology services into these procedures, but also how do we look at the sort of legal code that is following a smart device as it moves within these zones. So in the background, you can see a zoning plan that consists of 30 or 40 different zoning codes. If you're into Greek history, you could read a lot about this. The first sort of documents on zoning actually come from Aristotle's Politics, where he talks of the first city planner, Hippodamus, who he says both was the first city planner, but also the first political philosopher. And they're discussing a lot how the Greeks established three legal zones for physical space, being private, public, and religious zoning, and then designated the sort of subjectivity of the citizenry through the sort of legal instantiation of code within those three zones. So it's not only that you divide space into three explicit legal territories, you also sort of constitute the sort of subjective behavior within a democratic society or within a city-state in this context as being an embodiment of sort of migrating through those different legal territories. So sort of public conduct, private conduct, religious conduct, emerging from the sort of subjectivity of the citizenry within those zones. And so we could talk about sort of a lot of the history of democracy following the history of city planning, but I think we have 2,400 years or so of history of kind of these ideas being developed. And so I think tying some of the discussions about technologies sort of implications to democracy and the public realm back to sort of the foundational discussions about the relationship between sort of spatial design, city planning, and political philosophy will help us sort of understand why this argument, I believe, is both a historical argument, but it's also a sort of contextual argument when looking at how a lot of our technology services have sort of become sort of undemocratic, I guess you could say. This is a sort of timeline of how a typical building proposal works throughout the sort of history, going through its first sort of competition and public procurement, moving through regulation and zoning, then through construction, and then eventual heritage. And again, talking a little bit about zoning. For those of you who are a bit familiar with zoning, this is perhaps a bit too lengthy of a description of it, but I guess we could just sort of say that zoning specifies not only the sort of planning code and the procedures within that zone, but it also specifies the conditional uses of the land, which I think is important. And I'm looking at how this then connects to a technique known as geofencing, which is designating a sort of technology services behavior within a physical space. And so these boundaries, I argue, start to look quite a bit like a zoning plan. All of this is really sort of relies upon what's going on with 5G. So for those of you that are familiar with 5G, it's the sort of biggest, let's say, technological revolution within mobile signaling, basically since the GSM network in the early 90s. The reason why it's important for me is that the industry reports claim that it will have, at least in urban areas, millimeter accuracy. So whereas today with Wi-Fi and 4G and GPS, there can be a distance between 5 to 15 meters between a smart device's position in space and where it thinks it is. And that makes it very difficult for these sort of zoning codes to be, let's say, applied, because the phone can always say it wasn't there, or it wasn't exactly on that line. But with millimeter accuracy, we could really migrate between these sort of geofences and between these zones and be changing and modifying and regulating technology services as they move through space. A lot of this ties into the sort of virtual reality, Pokemon Go sort of discussion. So I think we're also seeing a lot of legal code being instantiated, which ties the sort of virtual realm into the physical. And we're also establishing quite a bit of legal precedent for how something like this would work. As I mentioned before, we're seeing a lot of sort of tech-free spaces emerge. This is Peter Carr, the Director of City Innovation in Hobart, Tasmania. He's actually gone through and designated a large park as being sort of internet-free, tech-free. And the question is then, how would you technically do that, but also how would you sort of politically and regulatory do that? And so it seems that within a sort of public realm discussion, the city does have the sort of legal means in which to do so. And with something like 5G, it likely will also have the technical means to sort of regulate an entire zone to be tech-free or to have some sort of nuance between what sort of services can be used in a space. We've seen similar things like the banning of facial recognition in San Francisco. We've seen experiments with small sites such as a cafe. So it's interesting to see that as spaces are working in this kind of sort of meme of tech-free, it's like, what does that mean? How would it be done? How could a private space enforce its own technology code through a zoning plan? And how would a sort of large public space do the same through a sort of political process, let's say? So we've been planning several of these types of sites here in Oslo. We've been calling it the Digital Agora, and just kind of workshopping this with public administration, with officials, with the local sort of authorities, and then with the public and artists and those interested. So we're on the kind of very start of this work, but we're starting to just kind of write down what the values that would be inscribed in some sort of idea of digital zoning would be. This is sort of the workshop setting that we're using to sort of build up the policy of these zones with also specific territories in Oslo, which I think is the most interesting component. And so you can see sort of the ideas that are coming out of these workshops, things like, how is data a common city wealth? What is the sort of idea of how does public data become publicly owned? So there's a lot of really interesting discussions that are coming out of this. And I think that also ties back to the Nordic region having a very high degree of trust between citizens and its government, among the highest in the world, and which gives us a sort of context to think about technology in a different manner. So how do we use geofencing to create different zones of data access, this sort of thing? So again, coming into this context as a researcher, it's interesting to just sort of feel out where we are. And I think the time has really come to have this discussion and to start prototyping how this would work. So these are some sort of service prototypes. So we're also working quite proactively with sort of business development. How could we start connecting? This is a door prototype for a bike shed in Oslo. So how do we start prototyping the relationship between smart objects and building components with sort of smartphones and sort of architectural practice? This is a student proposal working with augmented reality. How do we start working with sort of augmented reality zones and these sorts of things, which I think is becoming quite interesting. So this is a kind of spatial prototype for how 5G and augmented reality could work together, which is some of the courses I've been teaching here in Oslo. So we have a mix of architecture, urbanism, and design students working on this together. And again, this is sort of how we're looking at a sort of typical zoning plan, not only as a sort of public space proposal, but also how they work at individual buildings. So how do you sort of zone a building in relation to its program? And then how do you build a sort of technology component that follows along there? So the first test of something like this is just you holding your phone in your hand. And as you enter the various spaces, it just says garden, worship, eating, wet, etc. But then we can also begin to apply that to sort of application environment itself. So that was exactly 20 minutes, I think. I hope you enjoyed the talk. Please send me an email. It's kai.reaver@aho.no, or find me on the internet. I hope you have a great conference. I think we'll probably be talking on Zoom as well. So thank you very much, and best of luck with everything you're doing. Bye.